I really want to thank you for inviting me to come and speak about this report in particular. I think I was at a meeting at ODI in your old digs when this thing was first getting underway. And I liked the sound of it then, and I've been really, I really want to congratulate the team here in London, but also this impressive team around the South for this research. I think it really makes a huge contribution. I'm really delighted to talk about it because I think the findings of the APPP are, of the APPP, that's right, are really compatible with what we found in the Crisis States Research Center in many ways, even if we're not cited as much as I would have liked. But particularly in relationship to questioning prescriptions, the good governance agenda, David talked a lot about the consensus that exists, that there's a problem with the good governance agenda, but we have to look at the kind of notoriety, impact, and influence. A book that just came out very recently, Why Nations Fail, the latest installment of the Acemoglu and his colleagues' work, which nonetheless still proclaim a good governance prescription in relationships to institutions. And I think that that work is really not nearly as accomplished as might be seen from David's opening comments. It sees also the importance of rent coalitions, which can be either more or less developmental. This is a very big theme and an important theme, not only in our work, but from the stream of scholarship at SOAS, Mushtaq Khan, and whatnot. And I think the report provides a lot of further evidence of the importance of recognizing that actually there are patterns of rent allocations everywhere, and what we need to understand is what leads to some that are more developmental than others. And it also provides, like we did, I think, further understanding of why democratic prescriptions and first best market reforms, liberalization, privatization, may actually be counterproductive. I mean, I think both counterproductive in terms of achieving effective state action, but also counterproductive in terms of achieving growth-enhancing and poverty-reducing outcomes. I think this is extremely important, particularly in light of the Acemoglu phenomenon that I mentioned. And there's a moment in this report when the authors suggest that one has to turn on the head recent concerns about democracy, saying that instead of making development safe for democracy, we have to actually make democracy safe for development. And I think as a catchword, that's one of the very best lines of the report. I would put it in a big headline, actually. The report theorizes some of this very differently than we did, and in some cases I think much more effectively, particularly by juxtaposing collective action models to principal-agent models. I think this is very effective, very important, both in terms of further scholarship on this and also something to drill away at in terms of dissecting the assumptions behind a lot of the donor programs that are still ongoing in relationship to good governance. In other ways, I think the report is less effective than we were in theorizing, and I'll say something about that in a moment. That's particularly in relationship to persisting in deploying the terminology of neo-patrimonial regimes, rather than talking about forms of political organization and their impact on formation of rent coalitions. And I would like to discuss that a little bit in the discussion period if we can. I don't think it's a purely academic issue. But overall, I think the report argues for a rethink of both government actor strategies. I think that's really important. This report is not just for donors. This report really should be read by African leaders and young Africans who might want to actually change the direction of their governments. And in this sense, I think that we're speaking with one mind with some of the recommendations that came out in our recent meeting the challenges of crisis states. Now, I know the difficulties of trying to sum up 5 years of research in a single paper. It's a terrible challenge. The richness of the empirical work that was done in this program can't be reflected adequately in this concise and effective document, and it really requires, and I would urge everybody here to look into the individual products, the research papers and the policy briefs that derive from them, because it's a really rich treasure trove of findings, and for me, after reading the report, there's a lot more that I want to look into in terms of the specific papers which I haven't seen. Those which I have seen are extremely important in their own right. Now, what is really striking here in this synthesis and in this research work is that we're talking about what we would call the realpolitik of development. This is something that's often used in talking about international relations, but this is talking about what really exists on the ground. And I think in that sense, it's really a breath of fresh air in terms of examining political economy of African development. It breaks new ground in looking not at service delivery, and anybody who's been working around, like we have been, around the fragile states debate and discussion, but around all the donor programming to contribute to state building. It's hinged on service delivery, but instead by shifting the focus to the provision of public goods and merit goods, and looking at what are the real incentives and power equations that facilitate or block progress in securing public goods like clean water or transportation or education or health. This is a much sharper analytical frame, and the more that we can get away from service delivery and back to a discussion of the provision of public goods, I think the more that we'll be talking about the real kind of challenges that face African governments, but also donors trying to support them. And it's not simply looking at poverty reduction, and I think that's really important, but the conditions for economic transformation, or what some of us used to call, and I think maybe David even did too way back when, structural change. There's not enough about that in the report, and I would love that we might talk a little bit about it in the discussion in terms of the elements of economic transformation that you highlight. I think are probably more thoroughly discussed in your reports on the cotton sector research and other dimensions of the work. And this work, in its realpolitik sense, stops attempting to cast the problem of development in terms of supply and demand of good governance, whether looking at the supply from the top or the demand from the bottom. And I think this break with what David has identified as the principal agent model is one of the most striking theoretical contributions of the report. The world's not best understood as in terms of the rational behavior of individual actions, and it's certainly not best understood in terms of committed principles at the top or the committed principles at the bottom of society. So this is a big contribution, and instead trying to formulate and look at and find the collective action problems that stymie development both at the national level and what I found really interesting at the local level as well, and conceptualizing problems at the local level in terms of collective action problems. So this is not new. It's been done by Eleanor Ostrom, by Judith Tendler, by many people working in the field over the years. But what's important here is to draw this in squarely, make it front and center in terms of the debates about governance. What stands in the way of effective action that could benefit most elites, yeah, or most people in a community? That's what the analytical frame points to. Methodologically, this work is extremely rich. It's very eclectic. But if we look at the empirical terrain that was explored over this research program, it's very, very impressive. And I think it's a model in that sense of policy-oriented research that actually is based on evidence. There's a lot of rubbish thrown around about evidence-based research, some of it by ODI in an earlier period, certainly by the donor agencies. But I think here this research program demonstrates a real approach to evidence-based policy proposals. Now, I'd like to finish with maybe two cautionary messages or issues to throw on the floor for discussion. I mean, one I mentioned to and referred to already, and that has to do with the maintenance of this category of neo-patrimonialism. I don't think it helps, actually, because the neo-patrimonialism is such a broad church, as you clearly show in the report. It seems to mean little more these days than all that's not liberal democratic regimes. And I think you demonstrate that. But what you demonstrate really suggests that we ought to dispense with the category altogether, as my colleague Tandika Makindawiri has argued at the LSE. Instead, you're actually giving us in the report the building blocks for an alternative. Regimes with developmental or anti-developmental forms of rent allocation. And they may emerge from a variety of different arrangements or institutional systems that are more or less democratic, more or less authoritarian or corporatist, with different sorts of political organizations. I mean, even referring both to your research and the secondary literature you review, we see communist organizations, nationalist ones, political military organizations producing developmental rent coalitions and also producing coalitions that are definitively not developmental. And I think by doing this, we have a better framework in which to look at the whole terrain of performance, and not just what has been, kind of referred to and grouped together as neo-patrimonial. In a sense, we have a prism then where we can analyze what's going on in African polities, just like the advanced Northeast Asian polities, not to mention our own OECD polities, by looking at rent coalitions in this way. So it's not just a theoretical nicety, but I think that there are some really practical things implied here. The report claims that developmental neo-patrimonialism is very rare. I think this is an extremely important observation, but also maybe a very problematic one. They can't really be crafted. This is not a model to propose anywhere. It emerges out of history. But at the same time, the report says there's the agenda that is faced by development actors is building coalitions that can build states that are more developmental. And so I think, that still has to be looked at. You can do more. I think the development practice community can do more than look at local problem solving, though you have very sensible things to say about local problem solving as an important starting point for this. There's a challenge that's put forward by this report to African leaders and social movements around what might constitute the grounds for developmental coalitions. And at one point you talk about pacts around specific requirements for development that don't necessarily step on the toes of elites in ways that would lead them to reject them. And also, similarly, local alliances that are built on local movements, local charismatic leaders, etc. And you mentioned, for instance, infrastructure projects that all could agree on, or the promotion of viable smallholder agriculture, which would not necessarily step on elite toes, the securing of food security measures and reforms that pacts could be formed around elements like this, which in a sense are pacts to form developmental or developmentally inclined rent coalitions. You know, in a kind of, in another world, in another time, one would say that's kind of an agenda for political parties. And I think this, one of the things that comes out of your work, at least from an African political actor's point of view, may really be related to, you know, what would be the basis for forming a different kind of political party. How can the conditions of threat that gave rise to the developmental so-called neo-patrimonial regimes in Rwanda and Ethiopia that you describe in research so deeply and so interestingly, how can those be replicated, or how might they be replicated? We can see the kinds of threats that gave rise to these coalitions, perhaps facing actors in Kenya today, or in Nigeria. And if there's an understanding of how to face those threats that comes out of research like this, then one begins to look towards an agenda that's maybe a little bit more ambitious than the one that's concluded in this report. So I think that, you know, that leads me to my final point, and I know that I have, oh, I didn't realize I still had 2 minutes. I thought you're being very generous. And that's this proposition. It's not very big in your report, but you say development's not really about funding gaps. Well, you know, if you take this alternative view that turns around the need for developmental coalitions, that articulates or attempts to see the kind of rent coalitions that might be formed to promote economic transformation, then there still is a very old sense in which development aid needs to be able to fill financing gaps, where developmentally oriented rent coalitions need to be allowed, for instance, to run trade deficits and begin to engage in economic transformation, build the kind of infrastructure, et cetera, that's echoed in your report. And for me, in a way, I think that what comes out of this report is a new research agenda. We actually, some of us talked quite a bit about it, how it might be shaped, but it's around economic transformation. And perhaps, I don't know if more ideas about that have come out of your own discussions about this research. Thank you.